Hello, and welcome to another episode of Boundless Body Radio. I'm your host, Casey Ruff, and today we have another amazing guest to introduce to you now. Gil Carvalho, MD, is a physician, research scientist, science communicator, speaker, and writer. Dr. Carvalho trained as a medical doctor in the University of Lisbon in his native Portugal, and later obtained a PhD in biology from Caltech. He has published peer-reviewed medical research spanning the fields of genetics, molecular biology, nutrition, behavior, aging, and neuroscience. In parallel with his research career, Dr. Carvalho has also a passion for science communication. He directs and hosts Nutrition Made Simple, which aims to convey fundamental nutrition concepts to a general audience via educational videos, and his content is watched by over 500,000 people monthly. That is phenomenal. Dr. Carvalho's research contributions at Caltech, where he trained with pioneer geneticist Seymour Benzer, included the identification of genetic and nutritional mechanisms of longevity. Dr. Carvalho also pursued research with neuroscientist Antonio Damasio on the mechanisms of neural signal transmission in the sensory system and the neural basis of enteroception and feeling. Find Dr. Carvalho on YouTube at Nutrition Made Simple and on Twitter at Nutrition Made S3. Dr. Gil Carvalho, what an absolute honor it is to welcome you to Boundless Body Radio.
Thanks so much, man. My pleasure.
It's an honor to host you. I told you off air, the topic of our conversation is a little bit time sensitive. And as I was thinking about how to cover this, I wasn't going to just invite anybody to address this topic. And you stood out as somebody who put out some really good content around the topic. And it wasn't done in a way that you were, necessarily calling people out personally. You approached it in a really balanced way, which I really appreciated. So there's a reason I reached out and got you on the show and not somebody else. So I just right off the bat want to thank you for doing really, really good work. I'm just really grateful for you to be here today.
I really appreciate those kind words. Yeah, it's hard to sometimes to hit that balance, and this video was particularly difficult. And I try to be honest and still call out things that I think are done well or not well, but without attacking the character of the person, without insulting, without getting, into the mud, but still reporting the truth to the, as far as well as I can, because at the end of the day, the content is not about me or someone else that I'm talking to or about. It's about the listener. So that's the main concern.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And, both of us are into the business in a way of growing our channels, and that's important. I don't monetize my show, but it's important for people to find us, and it's a way that we get leads for our personal training and nutrition coaching businesses. And I don't want nobody to watch the shows, but I'm also not a fan of the people that do, again, that kind of clickbaity or the titles that don't really match the videos and all that stuff. And so I try to stay as ethical as I can around that. And I can tell that's a big priority to you as well. And you've been able to naturally grow your channels to have tons and tons of viewers without necessarily doing that kind of stuff as well, which again, I just really, really, I really appreciate. So kudos to you.
Thanks. Yeah, I've been playing with that, trying to make things watchable and, appealing without being deceiving. It's a hard balance to find, and especially when you've spent your entire life kind of trapped inside science labs, and then now you're trying to navigate this whole world of internet marketing, and these things it's like a different universe. But yeah, trying to learn as I go along.
Yeah, very good. Well, you're doing a great job, and just keep it up. It's really, really good work. Before we get into our topic today and your own personal story, I just have to say, amazing that you're in Portugal right now. It sounds like you're going to be traveling to Brazil. It's one of my favorite places. I spent some time there, and I've worked to stay fluent in Portuguese. I love sports documentaries on Netflix, like even obscure sports around America, like cricket documentaries. I just love, and rugby and all this stuff. It's, again, not as popular here. And one of my favorite sports documentaries was Captains of the World, which is all about the 2022 World Cup, which was really, really good. And it was so cool because I could listen to the Brazilian players, and as they talked, I'm listening along, and unless it's like slang that I don't know, I know exactly what they're saying, and I don't need the subtitles. But when I hear Cristiano Ronaldo talk from Portugal, I can hardly understand what he's saying. It's amazing how different the two languages are in Portugal versus in Brazil. It's nearly impossible for me to follow along.
The pronunciation in Portugal is much harder to understand if you're not used to it. But since you are already fluent in Portuguese, if you spend some time here, you get used to the musicality, to the sounds, then you pick it up pretty quick, because the words aren't that different, but it's mostly the pronunciation.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's reassuring if I ever come to Portugal, which I hear is absolutely beautiful. And you are in Lisbon proper.
I'm in Lisbon, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I hear the best things about it. I hear it's an amazing place, and it's a place I'll definitely have to visit. But let's get to hear your own personal story before we dive into our topic. How did you become so interested in nutrition? And tell us about the transition from, doing the research, but also having this desire to get a message out to the lay public where it can actually really make a difference.
Yeah, I about 6 years ago, give or take, I was looking for a way to contribute more directly to the public. Research is really exciting, but the problem is that there's a massive gap between doing something and figuring something out in the research project and then it actually benefiting the public, especially when you're doing basic research, studying molecular mechanisms or studying model organisms, animals in the lab. So yeah, I was looking for a way to bridge that gap. And I thought about different things, blog, podcast, YouTube, write a book. And then I kind of landed on the YouTube thing. And nutrition was a natural fit between things that I had done some work before. So during my PhD, we did a lot of work on longevity, kind of trying to figure out things that extend lifespan. And one of the things that is kind of a pivotal in that field is playing with calories, playing with different foods, playing with different nutrients, and looking at physiology. So that's something that I had worked on during grad school, doing kind of nutritional manipulations and looking at different physiological outcomes and longevity. So, and also from medical school, a little bit of background as well. So I took that background and the interest that I had, and I thought that was a nice fit with something that people are interested in. And when there's a huge disconnect between most of the information that people get exposed to about nutrition and then the actual science, sometimes people get the opposite messages or they get really confusing stuff. They get this kind of every week, the headlines try to give you whiplash. Last week, this food was good, and this week it'll kill you. And a lot of that stuff, if you grasp some basic concepts, you can like see through a lot of that confusion and just get a lot of peace. And at the same time, eat a healthy diet that where you still have a lot of choice and you get to personalize, but just understanding a couple basic concepts. So that's how I started kind of trying to impart some of that some of those scientific tools to the public, and then just to kind of build from there.
That's great. Yeah, no, I really love that. Is it safe to say that you would consider yourself kind of diet agnostic? Meaning like there's not like just one diet that you really like try to focus on?
Oh yeah, you mean in terms of effects on health?
Yeah, yeah, kind of what you promote and what you talk about.
Yeah, I don't think as if we consider diet like these name diets, keto, vegan, low fat, low carb. Yeah, I don't think that. I think there's many different variations of diets that can be healthy, and I actually think that probably from what I get, both from the science and in terms of feedback from people, that people do better in variations of diets because of personal preferences. Just
Yeah.
some people prefer lower carb, others prefer lower fat. And I think that with some tweaks and with some things in mind, all of these dietary patterns can be health promoting.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. As a nutrition coach, I'm not a dietitian, or I don't have a degree in this kind of stuff. But as a nutrition coach, I can help people with any diet as part of my training. But we choose to focus around here on more like the low carbohydrate, the ketogenic, and the carnivore. And the way I kind of explain it to people is like, yes, we're promoting the carnivore diet, but that just means that I really like Chevrolet cars and I work at the Chevy dealership. And if you want a Chevy, you might want to talk to me. I might have some information. I might be able to help you. But if you really like Ford, like I can tell you about, cars, but I can't really tell you about Ford. You need to go to the Ford dealership. And I kind of approach it that way, where I want to say like, that's just what we focus on around here, but we're not trying to say that this is the only way everybody has to do this all the time. This is just one option. And even within that space, whatever is working for you this week may no longer work for you next week. And you might have to be willing to, check yourself constantly to see what is working. And I like the way you said, like, quote unquote, name diets. When a diet has a name, it gets to be a little bit more challenging, and people get stuck in the minutia of what this diet is supposed to be versus like, is this actually helping me achieve my health and fitness goals?
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think the names sometimes confuse people, and we become almost religious about these things. But at the end of the day, it's not an on-off switch. This is like a dial. It's a continuous, it's a spectrum, right? These diets like low carb, that can go all the way from, 0 carb to 20 something percent carb. Low fat, same thing. Plant-based, I mean, that can be vegan all the way to Mediterranean and all these different things. So yeah, I think a lot of times these labels, if we over obsess about these labels, they end up being more limiting than helpful.
Yeah, no, I love thinking about it in that way. And, one of our guests pointed out that the standard American diet is a plant-based diet. There's more plants than animal foods in its standard American diet, and make that argument like, yeah, there's still a bunch of stuff you probably shouldn't be eating and all that ultra processed crap. But yeah, anyway, okay, awesome. So that cues up our discussion, which is going to be about a recent trial that was dropped, the KETO-CTA trial, very much anticipated, dealing with the question of the effect of diet and very high LDL cholesterol and ApoB on people that are doing ketogenic diets that have a certain leanness to them. How aware of that situation, lean mass hyperresponders, have you been in the past? Is this something you've been following for several years, or is it just something that's come to your consciousness more recently as this recent study has dropped?
No, I was aware of it much farther back. I mean, I remember talking to Dave, who spearheaded the study before the study was even in planning per se. I mean, he was thinking about doing it, and we talked about it, the idea like years and years ago, about 5 years ago, about the idea of studying these people and looking at plaque and how could that be structured. So I was aware that the study was in planning or in thinking many years ago, and that these ideas about this group of people. Now, I have some agreement and some disagreement with the ideas that circulate on the internet, but yeah, aware of the general thought and the general community. Yeah, many years.
Okay, great. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, it's a tough one because we think about Dave and his situation, how this even came to be. You go on a ketogenic diet, and for whatever reason, like everything gets better. He feels better, loses weight, um, and his triglycerides drop, which is generally considered a good thing. Your HDL cholesterol goes up, which is generally considered a good thing. But unlike his family, he noticed that his LDL cholesterol is quote unquote bad cholesterol that most doctors measure and want to lower at all costs. It went really, really high, way higher than he should have. And of course, he should be concerned. Started studying this, and over the years, different studies have come out, and they've been interesting. I would say not conclusive. Certainly, we haven't learned exactly what the long-term effect is going to be on somebody. But I always use this example of my friend Robin, who I met at several of these conferences. We're both mutual friends with Dave Feldman and met him as well. And she has been bipolar her entire life, and she learned about the ketogenic diet for weight loss, and she decided to try it along with her husband Matt, again just really dear friends of mine. And she started noticing that her brain health was improving, and that was kind of unexpected to her. But she also noticed this phenomenon that her cholesterol went way high, and her doctors wanted her on a statin, which is the whole reason she wanted to go on a diet anyways, to avoid getting on a statin. So with her bipolar got released. She got off of all of her medications, and she just has this one thing that's there. She also learned by working with another doctor that if she introduced as much as 1/2 of a sweet potato, just a small amount of carbohydrates, that her cholesterol would go right back down to where it needed to, which fits Dave's lipid energy model theory. But her bipolar symptoms would come back. And so now you've got this person, this real life situation where she's walking around trying to decide, if I go with the sweet potato, I'm bipolar again, and I'm crappy to my family, and I'm not present in my life. I'm back on the couch, or I'm medicated. Versus, well, the alternative is you're walking around with an LDL cholesterol that's really, really high. And I always like to just bring that point to say that, like, this matters to a lot of people for very, very real reasons, and they have to make very difficult decisions that I would not be envious of. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean that you described that really well, and you described the dilemma there very well. Two things I would ask are, one, has she tried variations of keto, still being very low carb, but being, some people call it keto med. There's a study that came out recently looking at ketogenic diets for brain cancer, and we covered it in a recent video, and they found some interesting results. But basically, they used a variation of keto that it focuses more on kind of olive oil and nuts and seeds, things like that, as opposed to butter and lard, right? So by switching to that type of fats, they didn't see hypercholesterolemia. They didn't see cholesterol go up. So they were still getting very low carb. In fact, the ketone bodies in this study were very high. So they were clearly in ketosis, but no elevation in cholesterol levels. So that's one thing I would ask someone if they've tried to play with that, if that still works, if that still gives them the benefits without the concern. The other thing that I would bring up is on the medication front. I know a lot of people have problems with statins, like intolerance, or they've heard horror stories. I understand that. There's a lot of other medications that are not statins that do the exact same thing. In fact, there's a lot of studies comparing different medications, and you get the same result as far as reducing heart disease risk, depending on how low you bring the risk factors, regardless of the type of drug. So that's another thing I would bring up, because some people might not be open to any drugs, but some might be like, oh, there's something that's not a statin that'll do the same thing. Yeah, I'm down to try that. So another idea.
Those are really fair points. I love both of those things. That, yeah, there's other alternatives that are not your classic statin that we've now discovered. And yeah, I have heard that you can play with the ratio of the fats to get different results. So I'm not sure if she's done that. I'll definitely message her and see if she's thought about that or tried that. But I've been with her at some of these conferences, and she is very strict carnivore. She kind of has to stay without much else getting into her diet, or she does experience more symptoms. But those are all fair points. And also, to be fair to the authors of this study, they've always said from day one, and even Dr. Budoff, who is the principal on this study, has always said that when we discover plaques, we are recommending treatment. It's not like we're saying that it is a good thing and everybody can just walk around with LDL cholesterol without consequences. Not what we're saying. We're saying we're looking into it and we're trying to chase this down, but we still don't know, and it could be problematic. And you should take this seriously, and you should work with your doctor on this.
Yeah, I mean, I would not. One thing that for me was always a little puzzling about this whole story of the cholesterol, and is that for me, these risk factors, cholesterol or ApoB, I don't know if you and your viewers know what ApoB is. If not, we can go into it, but they're related, right? LDL cholesterol and ApoB are related metrics, not exactly the same, but similar. They have similarities. For me, these risk factors are not fundamentally different from other risk factors like glucose level, blood pressure, smoking. They have similarities in the general way that they work in terms of the exposure and the exposure over time and kind of the risk exposure that we see. And then it's a statistical thing in population. So the way we think about risk factors is there's a lot of similarities. And so for me, it's not fundamentally different to see a population exposed to a very high ApoB level as opposed to a very high blood pressure or smoking, in terms of higher risk of disease in that population as a result of the risk factor exposure. But I understand that it's clearly here there is this concern specifically with the cholesterol and the ApoB, because these diets will improve a lot of metrics, but will often jack up that metric, and so it creates this very focused concern. So I get that.
Okay. Well, I don't even know if this is possible, but if you were in an elevator with somebody and you had to explain, briefly and simply the difference between LDL cholesterol and ApoB, could you be able to do that?
Depends how high we're going in the elevator.
We're going pretty high. We'll go high.
Just the Empire State Building, I could do.
Exactly.
No,
yep.
I can probably do 20 seconds. So these lipids like cholesterol, they travel in the blood wrapped in little beads, because just like oil and water don't mix, these fatty substances in our blood don't mix very well. So they travel in the blood packaged in these little beads. So these are the lipoproteins. And so LDL is actually a lipoprotein. HDL is another lipoprotein. And normally when you get a blood panel, you go to the doctor, you get your cholesterol measured, what's being given there is just a level of these fats that are present in the blood. So the amount of cholesterol being carried by the LDL lipoproteins is your LDL cholesterol. So it's kind of a surrogate. It's an indirect readout of the number of the particles. That's why it's kind of an imperfect metric. Sometimes, in general, populationally, you'll see a correlation with risk, but you can find studies where it doesn't track very well. So it's imperfect. The more perfect measure is the actual number of the particles, the number of the lipoproteins. And so ApoB is a count of the number of lipoproteins that are atherogenic, that cause heart disease.
Gotcha. Dude, we only made it to the 47th floor. Like, we've got a long way to go. What else do you want to talk about in the elevator? That was great. Really well explained. I love that. And yeah, when all of this was being conjured up in the beginning and the study was, being thought of and planned out, like most people were talking a lot more about LDL cholesterol, where in the more recent years, the conversation has shifted over to ApoB and that being a little bit more important. So it's good that they had been measuring both just in case, and they've got the blood somewhere and that can be analyzed at some point. But if that hasn't been already. But yeah, I thought that was a really, really good explanation. Do you feel would you like to set up the study and talk about like what they decided to do and what they wanted to measure, and kind of the history behind that? Are you pretty familiar with that?
Yeah, the study is relatively simple, the structure. They basically wanted to ask someone who has this risk factor, the LDL cholesterol slash ApoB, very elevated, but doesn't have any other risk factors. So blood pressure is not high, doesn't have diabetes, doesn't have insulin resistance, right? Doesn't have genetically induced high cholesterol. So just that one thing, which mirrors a lot of these people who go on these diets. So that was the question they were trying to ask. So they recruited 100 people with very high LDL cholesterol levels. It had to be 190 or higher. This is milligrams per deciliter. So this is extremely high in the normal population. Normal is usually under 100. And so usually if you see someone with values that high, you suspect like a genetic condition or something. And actually this was the floor, right? They had to be above that. The average was actually over 250, so extremely high.
Yeah.
And then they ruled out other major risk factors. So they couldn't have high blood pressure, they couldn't have diabetes, they couldn't be overweight or obese. So they were normal BMI. And actually the BMI, I believe, average was like 22. So they're pretty lean. They're healthy on that front. And then they have these two metrics, the HDL cholesterol and the triglycerides, which are respectively high and low. So high HDL, low triglycerides, which are kind of a readout of insulin resistance. So in those ranges, you're pretty much ruling out insulin resistance as well. And so, yeah, the idea is here is this population with extremely high levels of this metric, but they don't have any other concerns. What happens to their arteries over time?
Yeah, got it. Well explained. Okay, so we'll talk about limitations in a second, but when you heard about this study that was going to happen, what did you like about it? What did you say, like, wow, this is a good idea. I like this part of it. Again, we'll talk about limitations in a minute.
Yeah. So first of all, I think it's a good idea to measure regardless. Since these people, there's no ethical issue per se, as long as they are doing it out of their own free will, right? You can't tell people to go do this who are not already doing it. So ethically, that would never be approved. But since these people are doing it, and I understand that they actually advise them to medicate, advise them. So they are advised not to do it, and then these participants insist, no, I want to do it. At that point, it's ethically okay to just measure observationally. So I'm supportive of that, of measuring and seeing what happens. Scientifically, you always want to get, you want to measure something in different contexts, different populations, and you want to get as much information as you can to get a better understanding of all these factors. So I thought scientifically it's good, and I'm curious to see what happens. Other advantages or strengths, it's prospective. So instead of just one measurement one time, which is very tricky to interpret. Some studies are cross-sectional, so you just get one slice at a time. Hard to know what's going on, but prospectively, you get a before and after or multiple time points, stronger, more compelling. The technique they used is quite good. It's an angiographic technique. Basically, you inject contrast, and then you see the outline of the vessels. And it's pretty sensitive compared to, for example, people are familiar with the calcium score. That's something that only gives you the calcified plaque. This, you can see the calcified plaque, and you can also see soft plaque, which is much better because it picks up a lot of stuff. I mean, you could have no calcified plaque and have a lot of soft plaque. It sometimes happens, but here you get soft plaque as well. And soft plaque is actually the plaque that usually will burst and cause heart attacks and strokes. So it's very informative to know that. Yeah, those are some of the strengths off the top of my head. Yeah.
Cool. That's great. What about limitations? What things did you look at and say like, oh, well, this is going to be tricky?
scale, 1 year for a chronic disease, I think it still provides useful information, but obviously limited scale. The number of people would be an obvious one, 100 people. Often these studies, if it's not a randomized trial, if it's an observational study, you're often looking at thousands of people. So 100 people is a very small group for this type of study. The main limitation, I would say, is a lack of a control group. So in most studies, you have some population that you are comparing your population to, and they're running usually in parallel, and you're recording both at the same time, right? Because that makes it much easier to compare. Here, it was just this one group of people. So there's no what we call an internal control. And that comes into play later. Well, we might touch on that, but comparing this to other populations becomes tricky.
Yeah, got it. Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate that. I'm going to just kind of communicate how this has been portrayed by myself and other peers as this preliminary data was released. We saw that, the cohort of people that you mentioned had been on a ketogenic diet for 4.5 years. They did a test that scores 15 different sites between 0 and 3 for the buildup and gives them a score. So the preliminary data, it's preliminary. It's not showing you much, but you think these people have been keto for 4.5 years. They've got double the recommended amount of cholesterol on average, 260, 259, 260, something like that. And not one single person scores over a 10. Everybody's in the double digits, with a majority of the people scoring a 0. So on this particular measurement. So that's amazing. Already the preliminary data was amazing. Then they got kind of fortunate that a similar study was done independently called Miami Heart, which gave them a cohort of people that they could then match. These are people that are also metabolically healthy but don't have sky-high cholesterol. You can do a match and say that there wasn't any statistical difference between the two cohorts. In fact, if one were trending a little bit lower, it would have been the low carb keto cohort had slightly lower scores when they match controlled these. And then the 1 year data finally drops, and we get told that it's a greater than 90% of the participants don't have plaque progression. So if you started as 0, you finished it as 0, it was 90% of people either saw no progression or they saw regression in their numbers, and only 6 people saw progression out of the 100, so 6%. And it's looking really rosy, and it makes it into a movie. I went to a movie premiere at Dave Feldman's conference called The Cholesterol Code, and those data were released in the movie. And the movie features my friend Robin, who again I mentioned earlier, and it's a wonderful story. And then all of this confusion comes out on Twitter, and you start to look into what these people are saying and some of the critiques, and you're like, oh, this has some weight to this. So some of this data is coming from different sources that I didn't know of, or there were a few issues with the study that you did such a great job exposing. So again, I just wanted to give you that as like this is how myself and the community are feeling. Very optimistic. Then we see this shitstorm on Twitter, and then a lot of the authors look a bit confused. You got to talk to Matthew Budoff, and that was a very interesting, conversation you had. Some of these people, are going silent on social media, so you're not hearing a lot from Dave Feldman and the other authors, which is understandable. Dave just gave his first kind of interview addressing all of this a few days ago. Other than that, for the 2 weeks previous, he really didn't see him anywhere. So you've got this group of people that are very confused and are almost feeling a bit like betrayed, because they're the ones that crowdfunded the study. They wanted to see the numbers. No numbers were given. So anyway, can you tell us a little bit about how this kind of unfolded and what things were done incorrectly in the study, in your opinion?
Do you mind if I plug the charger? Might be like a couple seconds.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, I'm afraid that this might die mid conversation. All right, sorry about that. I don't know if you can edit that out, but
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so no, that was a really interesting timeline that you gave there. So just to address that in kind of the order that you gave it, some of the things that you said make sense. Some of the things really surprised me to hear, and I hadn't heard that before, and I'm not even sure how some of that information was relayed like that, because some of the stuff you said is literally the opposite of the data that's in the study. So real quick on the preliminary, the cross-sectional data, right? The baseline data. That was a study that came out a few months ago, close to a year now. Yeah, there I think there's two main limitations that I would point out. One is the cross-sectional aspect. So it's hard to know when that plaque accrued. Was it before the diet, after the diet? Just because we don't have the prospective element, which is the good thing about the 1 year data. The other thing I would point out, and this gets a bit more technical, but in my video I touched on that. They had two different measures, right? So they had one measure that was the primary outcome of the study, that is progression of soft plaque, what they call non-calcified plaque volume, NCPV. That's the main thing that the study was powered to detect. And that is detected, that is like a continuous variable. So you get a continuous number. Then they had something else called the total plaque score, TPS. But if you look at those results in the 1 year, in the recent study, the 1 year follow-up, there's quite a divergence there between the TPS and the soft plaque measurements. And I talked to Dr. Budoff about this. And I think part of this is coming from the fact that the TPS is a semi-quantitative measure. So you have scientists looking at the plaque and giving it a category. It's not a precise number, but they're dividing each plaque into 3 buckets: small, medium, or large plaque. So there's more room for error, I think, although Dr. Budoff is confident that this is a reliable metric, but I think we both agreed that the actual measurements of soft plaque are more precise. And when they disagree, that's more believable. But these are technical questions that I think are somewhat up for discussion. But the bottom line is that baseline data, if I remember correctly, only looked at TPS, at this buckets score. So I think there's more wiggle room for that. The 1 year data now, that shows the actual soft plaque measurements, which is the primary outcome of the study, the main thing that I think we have the highest confidence. And so there you said that the information they got out was that 90% of people had no progression and a bunch had regression. What's shown on the data that's reported on that study, and when you look at that figure, is almost the opposite of that. So one person shows what is possibly regression. So their measurement of soft plaque is a bit smaller after the year than before. I believe 3 dots are right on the line, the 0 line, so no progression. And then what's left? 96 dots are above the line, so in the direction of progression of plaque. Now, 2 caveats there. One is that the magnitude of progression, there was a huge variation. Some people are really close to the line, some are like crazy high. So enormous diversity. The other thing is, an argument could be made that there's a margin around the line somewhere where maybe it's not, maybe it's within the margin of error, or maybe it's such small progression that maybe it's not that meaningful. I'm open to that argument. The problem is, again, this is a 1 year follow-up. So you'd have to imagine that progression multiplied by 10 or 20 or 30, which is, the natural rate of progression of a chronic disease if you're like 40, right? And you're planning on staying like this your whole life. So yeah, the other, maybe those numbers came from the TPS score. I realize this is getting a little complicated, but they also had, just to wrap up, they had also the TPS reported in this 1 year study, and that looked pretty different. I think it was 6 people that had a lower TPS score after the year, many that were on the line with no progression, and then I don't know if it was maybe 20, or I don't remember exactly the number, that had progression. So yeah, that's a kind of a summary of everything.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I appreciate that. And again, like, I've been following this story. I know something about this. I don't know everything about cholesterol, but like, I know something about this. I've been following this, and I can say this last week, this is the first time I've heard of a different, more quantitative way to analyze plaque in the heart. Nobody talked about that. Nobody mentioned that. I didn't know this was AI powered and how accurate that would be. And again, the story that we had all collectively been told is that this is coming out really good for 94% of the people. And it's even the way you brought it up with Dr. Budoff is like, the paper says, the print part of the paper says that it produced in most people stable progression, but when you look at the graph, it goes up. And so, like when you brought this up to Matthew Budov, it was interesting to yeah, it was his reaction was very interesting to Seymour questions. I'll just say that.
Yeah, and I mean, there are things in science we always like to be cautious and put a lot of qualifications. And so, listen, this AI technique, is it possible that there are some false positives there, that the technique is picking up some plaque where there is none? I guess that's possible. I would still be concerned because when you look, if it's error, wouldn't the error go in both directions? And so sometimes you might see as much regression as progression, and we see 90 something percent. Like if you look at the graph, it's such a clear trend towards progression. It's hard to explain much of that using just the technique, unless there's some aspect of the technique that biases towards more plaque and not less. So yeah, I think I remain open to kind of technical issues, and I think we should always wait for confirmation of things, and especially in a study like this that is small and has all these issues, I wouldn't exclude changes and I wouldn't exclude other possibilities, but I would absolutely say that it's a concern. The results are a concern. And the other thing I would add is that, I mean, understanding from the point of view of most health professionals and people in this field in cardiovascular disease and lipidology, that this study doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? This study looks at a disease and a risk factor where we have just a colossal amount of information going back decades. And so this is why most health professionals and most people in cardiology and lipidology are very concerned about this, because we have reason to believe that this is a problem in every context we've looked at. Here's a context where people are hoping that it will be an exception. Is that theoretically possible? Sure. Would I risk I wouldn't put my life on the line on those odds for any risk factor, right? I mean, blood pressure, sky-high blood pressure hasn't been shown to be an issue specifically on a very low-fat diet or a Jenny Craig diet or, am I going to bet my life on that being an exception? Absolutely not. And so I think this is a massive concern. I think a lot of this has to do with, like you said, people find benefits here, that things that they struggled with. And so they want to believe that it's okay. I am deeply concerned that I'm sure some people will get away with it because that's how risk factors work. But I'm deeply concerned that a number of people will have problems that could have been avoided. So yeah, this is what I would do if it was a loved one, right, that I deeply care about. Let's say they're in the position of your friend. They have these devastating health issues. Nothing else works. This works. I wouldn't tell them to go do the diet that makes them miserable, but I wouldn't leave no stone unturned. I wouldn't ignore cholesterol. I wouldn't say, oh, no, I'm sure everybody's wrong. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't play those games. I would say, look, I'm going to leave no stone unturned. If we can find tweaks of this diet that give you the benefits without the hypercholesterolemia, or if we can find some medication that that you can tolerate without problems and solves this problem, that's what I'm going to bet on.
I love that. I think that's very well balanced. You mentioned that the difference and yeah, difficulty of measuring in this way. Again, I'm not very familiar with the technology. I'm just learning about it now and how it's working and giving those numbers. And there's a series of interviews on the podcast Metabolic Mind where Dr. Brett Scher interviews Matthew Budov twice in 2 different episodes, and interviews Dave Feldman once after this had come out. And again, glowingly positive on all counts. Caveats for sure, and they tend to bring those up. And that's where Matthew Budov says, like, the people with plaque, we definitely recommended treatment. This is a treatment naive population. They've never been treated for this, and so that's on the table. But one of the main criticisms of the study is that the preliminary data that was the primary thing, the thing that you're measuring, were not released with this paper. And when pressed about it, Dave Feldman had to come out and like apologize. And it's almost like he didn't realize it or they didn't check it. But like the number one thing that people wanted to see was the data. And that's, people are quite upset about it. And so nobody could figure out, like, we see the lines on the paper and we see that it's trending up, but you don't really know how high it's going. And they make a prediction in the paper by how much they think it's going to go up. And then it was released by another mutual friend, Dr. Adrian Sotomoda, who came out on Twitter to say the number was 18.8 versus, I believe, 7 that they predicted originally. And so, in your opinion, and another limitation, I can't remember if you mentioned this or not, but there was no control for this study. And they told us that from the very beginning. They didn't have enough money being crowdfunded to do a control, which is, understandable. But anyway, we don't really know, like, 18.8, is that a lot? Is that a little? It's more than what they thought it was. Can you talk about the rate of progression, and is the rate itself concerning, or is it also like a big relative jump, but the numbers are still, absolutely small kind of a thing?
Yeah, so regarding the specific numbers, because this has been disputed, right? Dr. Budoff, when I asked him about it, he said that was not the number, or that it was uncertain. He certainly didn't own that number. So anyway, let's say it's not 18.8. I don't think it makes a big difference, because I've seen several scientists now who just took that figure and put it through software, and it can calculate, within a pretty good margin. And so it's around 20, give or take, right? That ballpark, 20 millimeters cubed over the year. Unless the figure is wrong. But if the figure is right, it's going to be that ballpark number. Now, is that high or low? This is the main problem, is when you don't have a control group, it's hard to know where you're sitting. So what they did in that study was they compared, which I think is reasonable, is they had a supplementary table where they said, this is the value for our study, and here they actually used something else. They had some other measure. They didn't use this soft plaque progression. That's another point that some people criticized. They used some other metric called PAV, plaque atheroma volume. Anyway, it's another metric of plaque and the percentage of the lumen that is occupied by plaque. So they used that number, and they looked at that corresponding number from other existing studies in other populations that are obviously not similar to this in many ways. But basically they said, okay, it's comparable, it's similar in general to these other to the rate of growth in these other populations. There's a lot of problems with these comparisons, because these populations have a lot of differences, right? So these are kind of for typical Westerners. Usually blood pressure is not great and cholesterol is not great, and they're a little chubby, and some smoke, some have diabetes. There's a, kind of a more typical population. And also a chunk of these people are usually on statins or equivalent drugs. So it's like, at face value, it's not very reassuring, because you're seeing a plaque growth that is in the ballpark of these fairly sick Westerners that are being followed up with these with these imaging techniques for heart disease. On the other hand, there is a valid criticism there, which is the statins, because we know that statins will slow down and stop plaque growth. And so these folks, a percentage of them are on statins. So that will slow down the plaque in these comparison groups, whereas this group, the keto group in this study, was not on medication, not on lipid-lowering medication. So one argument is, okay, it's not apples to apples. It's making the keto group look worse, because these guys have been, with the statins, are artificially slowing down their plaque progression. I think that's a reasonable argument. I think there's some truth there. So one thing I try to do in my video, which is also not without complications by any stretch, is I use another cohort where they're not on statins, so 0 statins, and they're actually a pretty healthy group for Westerners, for Western standards, for US. So no diabetes whatsoever in that group, and they're healthier. The idea was, let's look at plaque progression in a healthier group of individuals. What's like the natural progression of plaque? And so what I showed in that video is that what they reported, this isn't fully published yet, but it was the abstract, the summary of the results was released in a meeting last year. And so it was about 5 millimeters cubed over a year of soft plaque progression, median. And I said in the video, so this would be 5 in these guys, and then 18.8 or whatever in that range for the keto group. Now, Dr. Budoff has also pointed out that this isn't also a great comparison, because you have to match for baseline plaque, individual by individual, that it's a very rough comparison. And I think he has a point. So bottom line, the comparisons are dirty. We don't have a great comparison, because you don't have an internal control. We already know from the get-go it's going to be like that. looking at the numbers at face value, the numbers that we have and that have been released, same thing that I said before, I think it's a concern. I would not be reassured if I was in this position. I would not want this rate of plaque progression. The other thing to add context, we have a lot of information on plaque progression in other contexts. We know that there are diets shown in randomized trials, actually, so a higher standard of evidence. Diets that stop plaque progression, diets that reverse plaque progression. This has all been shown. So, Mediterranean diets and DASH diets and things like that have been shown to reverse plaque. These medications have been shown to reverse plaque when you push these risk factors low enough. So I would always be very worried about having someone growing plaque over the long run when we know that's not necessary. Yeah, I would just say it's a concern all around for me based on the evidence that we have. And I know that I think I've made this clear, there's a lot of question marks and a lot of haziness because of the experimental design. We knew that was going to be like that. But I actually think the results were a bit more startling than I expected. I expected them to be a bit more gray, a bit more unclear, but they leaned more in the direction of concern than what I thought was going to come out. So
fair point. Yeah, one term that keeps coming up is plaque begets plaque, where basically they showed the people that started with a higher amount of plaque added more plaque than the other people. Is that fairly true from what you know?
Yeah, and as from my knowledge of this field, that's common. You see that, and you look at other imaging studies that are not looking at keto, just look imaging studies in general. The heterogeneity is something common. So you normally see just some people growing plaque really fast, some growing plaque really slow. And that's the same for any risk factor. If you look at a population of smokers, some people get lung cancer and are all messed up. Some people live to 100 and whatever and don't get lung cancer. So that's always the case. Some people just have bomb genetics and can handle it. So the heterogeneity is normal. What were you asking about specifically? It was further than the heterogeneity.
And it was just the plaque begets plaque. The people that had the most gained the most, and so that matches what you know about that.
Yeah. You see that in other imaging studies that people who start out with more plaque tend to have faster plaque progression, which I think makes sense. Also, the plaque already being there is identifying people who have susceptibility to plaque being formed. So just by that logic alone, it doesn't surprise me. But yeah, it's something that's seen commonly. The other side of the equation, I don't know if you want to get into that, but the other side of the title that they had was plaque begets plaque and ApoB does not. And I think that's also been questioned on social media. I questioned that in my video. I think that was wildly overstated. I don't think that belongs front and center. I think they ran an analysis that is very exploratory, and I think it's okay to run that analysis. I think it's okay to report it in the paper, but I think the prominence that was given to the result of that analysis, I don't think is appropriate. I think it was put front and center in the title and the summary of the paper, and the communication on social media kind of focused on that almost exclusively, and I don't think that's appropriate because we have lower confidence for that result than the plaque progression which was the primary outcome. So anyway.
That was the messaging. That was the message that came out in the movie that I saw. Again, very well made movie. And I went back and watched it again to be sure to check this. But that was the main picture was, the greater than 90% showed no progression based on, the semi-quantitative data, the scoring system that I told you about. And then, or that was also in the paper. But also that the correlation between ApoB and plaque progression, it was a scatter plot. It was a shotgun shot, and there was no association between the two. So that was the messaging, and that's, again, you said very prominently, been kind of portrayed and shown out there. And so that was going to be my next question to you: is what do you think of the data that, or the message that shows that ApoB and or LDL cholesterol did not correlate with how much plaque somebody added? Meaning, if somebody had the 190 LDL cholesterol versus the 300, 400, there's no correlation there. Yeah, I was going to ask you how you responded to that. You don't think the evidence is as strong as maybe they've been leading with?
So before getting into that, I pulled up the paper real quick just to check that the TPS result. And I'm looking at the figure, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then, yeah, there's another, the figure is a little strange, and I've had, some people have questioned if there's something wrong with the figure, but the above the line of zero, so people who are leaning in the direction of progression, even looking at TPS, not looking at soft plaque, it looks like it's about at least 30 people. So even that 10% I find strange. I don't know where they got that, unless this graph is not correct. But looking at the graph in the paper, at least 30 people or so have a higher TPS, a class of plaque after than before. And again, remember, this is like 3 buckets, right? So I think it's important to realize you can have growth and still be in the same category, especially if your plaque is small to start with, which would be expected in this group because they're relatively young. They're 55 average, and they don't have any other risk factors. And they've been on this diet for like 5 years. So most of their life, the 50 years of their life, they had no risk factor or, very low risk. And then for a relatively short period of time, they have this sky-high cholesterol. The point is, if you start out with a very small amount of plaque, you're going to be in the small bucket. And even if your plaque grows, you might still be in the small bucket by the end of the year. That doesn't mean there wasn't growth, right? And because this is exponential with 10, 20 years, 30 years, by the time it jumps to the second bucket, that's a massive growth if you started out with very small plaque. Just to kind of contextualize. Okay, the LDL and ApoB result. Yeah, two main concerns with that, just to make it short, not to drag this on too long. One problem with that is that everybody has extremely high cholesterol to begin with. So even if we believe this result, that a cholesterol of 200 versus 400 doesn't make a difference, it tells us nothing about going from normal to high, which is the main question, right? I want to know what happens if I go from normal cholesterol to high cholesterol, if that raises my risk of heart disease or not. If I get to 200 and 400, there's no additional increase. Okay, good to know, but doesn't answer the rest of the spectrum. So that's one concern. The other concern is that even looking at that result, the 200 to 400, and I've talked to statisticians and everything about this, there isn't a lot of confidence that they had the statistical power to detect a difference. And if you look at the ApoB graph, it trends up. It does not reach statistical significance. And I don't think we want to over speculate on things that are not significant. I don't think we want to say, oh, maybe it would be. We don't know. But a study with 100 people that was not powered for this analysis, it was not pre-registered. So this is not an analysis that the study was designed to support. So I think the confidence there is pretty low. And I think it would be okay to add that in the paper in the end, but not the level of PR that was put behind this message. I think that's concerning. And I think if in the future this is confirmed, I'll believe it, but I don't have a very high level of confidence that this will pan out.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. I want to wrap this by asking kind of your own personal opinion. You know Dave. I know Dave. I consider him my friend. Adrian, Nick. I know all these guys, and I love their work and respect them. Like I said, Dave did an interview where he owned all of this and he apologized to the community and apologized for the mistakes that were made and the data wasn't included and the numbers didn't get out and all this stuff. And they're very smart people, and they're going to get the data out. They're going to find ways to have better messaging around this. That part of things, I think they're going to be able to recover and at least have more numbers, have better studies, ask different questions. Again, they're very smart people, and I think they're going to recover from this. Just in your own personal opinion, when I look at this, I see the problem as one more of like optics. Like the way this came out, it just doesn't look very good. And it's, again, in the community of the people that I know that are doing this, that are on the pages on Facebook and wanting these answers, they feel a little hurt and a little betrayed, and they kind of should. And so can something like this really just have a lot of negative implications in the future? Like, is there a risk that more research might not be done or more funding might not be done? Like, how do you see this, again, just in your own personal opinion, when something gets goofed up in a study like this? What are the implications that you could potentially see?
Yeah, I think it's a massive concern. I don't know about the funding. I mean, that's going to depend on people who, because this was funded by crowdsourcing, right?
Yeah.
By crowdfunding, by getting contributions from people. So that's going to depend on what people want to do. But so I can't speak to that. But I can tell you that it's interesting because this community and scientists in general in this field, where I know that this community, a lot of times there's mistrust towards scientists in general, and there's a lot of hesitation there. But on this, I think there was a lot of alignment, because what you're describing with these people feeling maybe frustrated or let down or what's going on, there was a level of outrage from scientists in general when they saw this, and from all camps. Actually, some of the most aggressive takedowns I saw were from people who eat low carb diets or clinicians who prescribe low carb diets, and were very angry, I think is fair to say, with how this was written. Not just the presentation on social media, that's like a different chapter, but how this was written. Because to show a graph and then write something else, it's like some of these things are bizarre. Like you have a graph where most people are progressing, and then you say most are stable with one regressing. It's like, are you writing this for Stevie Wonder? Like, anyone who looks at this graph is going to know that that's not, it's like almost a disrespect towards people's intelligence to write it that way in a scientific study. So yeah, and I don't want to like attack people personally. I've always had a civil relationship with Dave. I disagree vehemently with many of the ideas and how this is communicated on social media, and I was very clear about that in the video. I don't have any personal, issues with Dave. I don't wish him any harm, but we have very different ways of doing things. And so, yeah, I have a scientific concern on one hand that this going through peer review, that's another problem. The peer review was a massive failure. How do peer reviewers not pick up some of these things? How do the editors let this through? And then, to add insult to injury, after many of these mistakes were pointed out and the authors either did not complain or even in some cases acknowledge that it was a problem. And in my interview with Dr. Budoff, for example, a lot of his responses were kind of reassuring me that this was being changed. A few days later, they issued a statement saying no changes are going to be made. So that version that everybody was tearing apart became the final version. No changes were made. Became the framed version in the scientific literature. I think from the scientific community, there's kind of disbelief that this is even going on, like the level of, I'd say, audacity of just, yeah, we've been pilloried for doing things this way. We admitted that these are mistakes, but we're not going to change anything. We're just going to leave it. That to me is the most shocking part. So at that level, at the scientific level, I think it's a dark kind of episode. At the public communication side, I think it's also extremely problematic, confuses people, sends people in the wrong direction. Now, and maybe it's a nice note to kind of wrap things up. I'm a very optimistic guy at the end of the day, and I think these things in the long run tend to rectify, and we tend to get things right in the long run. And I think there's a silver lining here. First of all, the fact that we're sitting here talking is a silver lining, because maybe before the study came out, you wouldn't have invited me to come on, and people wouldn't have wanted to hear from me. I don't know. I can tell you that a lot of people from low carb and carnivore podcasts have been reaching out, which wasn't happening before. And I'm happy to go on those podcasts. I actually like it more because I'm not preaching to the choir, and I like kind of the different ideas. And so that, I think, is a silver lining, the fact that people are talking and hearing what other people are saying. I hope this cultivates some healthy skepticism, that people question everyone, question me, like no one is infallible. Everyone has their biases, everyone has their failures. Listen to what people say, but then investigate, right? This is life and death. It's the #1 cause of death in humans worldwide is heart disease. It's not a joke. So somebody on the internet tells you something, including here, including me, listen to that, but investigate. Do due diligence, right? Don't just trust. I know that's tough, but it's a vital skill nowadays.
Yeah. Very, very well said. And I think that's a wonderful way to conclude this show. I'm personally very happy that a lot of those podcasts have been reaching out to you. I look forward to seeing more of your content. And yeah, at the end of the day, I mean, I take it back to where we kind of opened this thing up. This is my friend Robin. This is her husband Matt, who make decisions that are very, very critical and important, and are waiting to see this information so that they can decide how to proceed. And so I think that's a wonderful message, and people need to be on their toes as far as that goes. And so we'll see how this story develops. For now, on behalf of the low carbohydrate community, the carnivore community, thank you very much for the video that you made. And thank you very much for taking the time to be on our show today to provide a very balanced and nuanced conversation. We really, really appreciate it. This is something that we wanted answers to, and is a life and death thing, like you said. And so, again, on behalf of everybody, I really hope your channel grows a lot more and more people in our community find you and your work, because you have a great way of presenting it. And again, people want answers. So thank you, Dr. Carvalho, for very much for being on our show today. Where would you like people to go to find you and connect with you and your work?
Nutrition Made Simple on YouTube. You'll find all the videos, that one and everything else. And yeah, we welcome criticism. We welcome feedback. People from all walks of the nutrition world are welcome, and might not agree with some of the things we say, but you know, the point is not to convince you of anything. The point is to show you evidence. And I don't hope that you agree with me or that but you believe me. I hope that you click the studies and check for yourself and kind of develop a bit of a critical sense. And yeah, I really appreciate the invitation. I'm happy to come on anytime. And yeah, I love the meeting of different views. And yeah, I think this is a step forward.
I agree very much. And yeah, thank you so very much for taking the time to do this. Also, very, very jealous that not only are you in Portugal right now, but you will be in Brazil in a little while. You'll be in Rio, which is awesome, another city that I haven't checked out. So I hope you enjoy that thoroughly.
Thanks, man. I'm sure I will.
That's awesome. Well, thank you again, Dr. Carvalho, very much for being on our show today. We really appreciate you.
Thank you.
Of course. And this has been another episode of Boundless Body Radio.